In the heart of Central Africa, where the mighty Congo River carved its path through ancient forests and fertile valleys, there rose a kingdom so powerful, so vast, that its influence would reshape the destiny of an entire continent. This was not a land of scattered villages or warring tribes. This was the Kongo Empire, a sophisticated civilization that commanded armies, forged alliances, and built monuments that stood as testament to African ingenuity long before European ships darkened its shores. The year was 1482, and the world was about to witness a collision of empires that would echo through centuries, a tale of ambition, betrayal, and ultimately, African resistance against colonial conquest. The story begins not with war, but with wonder. When Portuguese explorer Diogo Cao sailed into the mouth of the Congo River, he encountered something his European mind had not prepared him for. Here, along the western coast of Africa, stood cities with stone buildings, markets bustling with traders from distant lands, and a royal court that conducted diplomacy with the sophistication of any European monarchy. Congo, the king of Congo, ruled from his capital at Mbanza, Congo, a city perched high on a plateau, commanding views that stretched across the kingdom like a lord surveying his domain. This was not the dark continent of European imagination. This was a thriving civilization, and the Portuguese knew immediately that they had stumbled upon something extraordinary. The Congo Empire traced its origins to the 14th century, when a legendary warrior named Lukeni Luanimi crossed the Congo River and conquered the lands that would become the heartland of his kingdom. Through strategic marriages, military campaigns, and political maneuvering, Lukeni's descendants expanded their territory until the Congo controlled vast regions, stretching from the Atlantic Ocean deep into the interior of Central Africa. By the time the Portuguese arrived, the kingdom encompassed an area larger than many European nations, with a population numbering in the millions. The empire was divided into provinces, each governed by officials appointed by the Congo, creating an administrative system that ensured loyalty and tribute flowed to the capital like rivers to the sea. The economy of Congo was as sophisticated as its political structure. Markets in Mbanza, Congo sold everything from locally woven raffia cloth to copper jewelry crafted by master artisans, from ivory carvings to iron tools forged in workshops that hummed with the rhythm of hammers on anvils. The kingdom's currency, shells known as nzimbu, harvested from the waters off Luanda Island, facilitated trade across vast distances. Merchants traveled established routes, protected by the king's authority, carrying goods that connected the Congo to trading networks stretching across Africa. Agriculture thrived in the fertile soil, with farmers cultivating yams, millet, and bananas, while hunters brought meat from the surrounding forests. The land was rich, the people industrious, and the kingdom prosperous. But it was the social and spiritual fabric of Congo society that truly defined its civilization. The people worshipped Nzambi Mpungu, the supreme creator god, alongside a pantheon of ancestral spirits who guided the living and maintained the cosmic balance between the physical and spiritual worlds. Religious leaders, known as Nganga, served as intermediaries between these realms, their wisdom sought by commoners and nobility alike. The Congo himself was considered semi-divine, his authority derived not merely from military might, but from spiritual legitimacy, a sacred connection to the ancestors who had founded the kingdom. This spiritual dimension infused every aspect of Congo life, from the ceremonies that marked planting seasons to the elaborate funeral rites that ensured the dead would join the ancestors in honor. When Diogo Cao returned to Portugal with tales of this African kingdom, King João II saw opportunity. The Portuguese were in the midst of their age of discovery, driven by a hunger for gold, spices, and the legendary wealth of the Indies. Africa represented both an obstacle and an opportunity on this quest. The Portuguese had already established trading posts along the West African coast, exchanging European goods for gold and increasingly enslaved people. But the Congo was different. Here was a centralized kingdom with the infrastructure to facilitate large-scale trade, a ruler who could negotiate as an equal, and resources that could enrich Portugal's coffers. The Portuguese king dispatched emissaries, missionaries, and traders, armed with gifts, religious texts, and promises of friendship. The Manicongo who received these Portuguese envoys was Nzinga, a Nukuwu, a ruler whose reign would mark the beginning of a complex and ultimately tragic relationship between Congo and Portugal. Nzinga, a Nukuwu, was a pragmatic leader, a man who understood that the world was changing and that his kingdom needed to adapt. The Portuguese brought strange technologies, weapons that spat fire and thunder, ships that could traverse oceans. They spoke of a powerful god and a distant king who commanded nations. Nzinga and Kuwu listened, calculated, and made a decision that would alter the course of Congo history. He would welcome the Portuguese, learn from them, trade with them, and use their knowledge to strengthen his own kingdom. It was a gamble, a high-stakes diplomatic maneuver, and for a time it seemed to pay dividends. In 1491, a momentous event occurred that symbolized the new relationship between Congo and Portugal. Nzinga, a Nukuwu, converted to Christianity, taking the baptismal name João in honor of the Portuguese king. It was a calculated move, designed to secure Portuguese support and legitimize his rule through association with a powerful European monarch. Portuguese missionaries arrived in greater numbers, building churches alongside traditional sacred groves, teaching Latin to young Congo nobles, and introducing European customs to the royal court. The Manicongo's son, Mvemba and Nzinga, embraced Christianity with particular fervor, studying scripture, learning Portuguese, and absorbing European ideas with the enthusiasm of a true believer. This young prince would soon inherit a kingdom at a crossroads, a civilization on the cusp of transformation, and he would face challenges that would test every ounce of his faith, his cunning, and his courage. The death of Nzinga, a Nukuwu, in 1506 unleashed a succession crisis that would define the future of the Congo Empire. Mvemba and Nzinga, the Christian prince who had taken the baptismal name Afonso, faced opposition from his half-brother Mpanzu Akitima, who represented the old ways, the traditional religion, and those nobles who viewed Christianity as a foreign corruption of Congo identity. The kingdom stood divided, pulled between two visions of its future. Mpanzu, Akitima, commanded significant support among the provincial governors and military leaders who resented Portuguese influence and feared that Christian conversion would undermine the spiritual foundations of royal authority. Afonso, backed by Portuguese missionaries and those nobles who saw advantage in European alliance, prepared for a battle that would be as much about the soul of the kingdom as about the throne itself. The confrontation came swiftly and decisively. According to the accounts that have survived, the two brothers met in battle near Mbanza, Congo, their armies clashing in a struggle that would determine whether the Congo would embrace the new religion or reject it. Legend holds that at the crucial moment, when Mpanzu Akitima's forces seemed poised to overwhelm Afonso's smaller army, a miraculous vision appeared in the sky. The soldiers on both sides witnessed what Christians interpreted as the cross of St. James, shining brilliantly above the battlefield, and this divine intervention, so the story goes, caused panic among Mpanzu Akitima's troops. They broke and fled, leaving Afonso victorious. Whether divine miracle or clever psychological warfare, the result was undeniable. Afonso, I ascended to the throne as Manicongo, and Christianity became the official religion of the Kongo Empire. Afonso I proved to be one of the most remarkable rulers in African history, a monarch who would spend nearly 4 decades navigating the treacherous waters between maintaining Congo's sovereignty and managing an increasingly problematic relationship with Portugal. He was a true believer in Christianity, filling his court with crosses and religious imagery, building churches throughout the kingdom, and educating Congo nobles in European languages and customs. He sent his son Henrique to study in Portugal and Rome, where the young prince would eventually be consecrated as a bishop, the first sub-Saharan African to achieve such ecclesiastical rank. Afonso corresponded regularly with Portuguese kings, writing letters in Portuguese, addressing them as fellow Christian monarchs, and requesting teachers, craftsmen, and priests to help modernize his kingdom. But Afonso was no naive puppet. He was a shrewd politician who understood that knowledge was power. He invited Portuguese stonemasons to teach Congo craftsmen European building techniques, incorporating stone construction into Mbanza Congo's architecture. He welcomed blacksmiths who could forge better weapons, upgrading his army's capabilities. He absorbed European military tactics, reorganizing his forces to better utilize firearms and cannon that the Portuguese provided. Afonso transformed the Congo military into a formidable force, combining traditional African warfare strategies with European technology, creating an army that could project power across vast territories and defend against any threat. The Congo was building a modern African kingdom, one that could stand as an equal to European powers. Yet, even as Afonso strengthened his kingdom, dark clouds gathered on the horizon. The Portuguese appetite for enslaved people was growing, driven by the sugar plantations of São Tomé and the expanding colonial enterprises in Brazil. What had begun as a trickle of captives taken in traditional African wars soon became a flood, as Portuguese traders, operating along the Congo coast and in the interior, began purchasing anyone they could acquire. The carefully regulated system that Afonso had tried to maintain, where only war captives and criminals could be sold, began to collapse under the pressure of Portuguese demand and the greed of corrupt officials. Portuguese merchants worked with renegade Congo nobles, bypassing the king's authority, raiding villages, and selling freeborn Congo citizens into slavery. The kingdom's population began to drain away, its social fabric tearing at the seams. Afonso, I understood the existential threat this represented. In a series of increasingly desperate letters to King João III of Portugal, the Congo pleaded for intervention, for regulation, for justice. His words, preserved in Portuguese archives, stand as testimony to his frustration and his fading hope. He wrote of Portuguese traders who corrupted his nobles with European goods, who encouraged kidnapping and false accusations to generate captives for sale, who violated every agreement and treaty. He described how sons of nobles were being seized and shipped across the Atlantic, how entire villages were disappearing, how the very foundations of Congo society were crumbling. Afonso begged the Portuguese king to send only priests and teachers to end the slave trade that was destroying his kingdom. But his pleas fell on deaf ears. Portugal's economy had become addicted to the profits of human trafficking, and no amount of Christian brotherhood would overcome that economic imperative. Congo's disillusionment grew as he realized that Portugal viewed the Congo not as an ally, but as a resource to be exploited. Portuguese traders operated with impunity, protected by their nation's growing military presence along the coast. When Afonso attempted to restrict their activities, they simply bribed his officials or moved their operations to areas beyond his direct control. The king, who had once believed in partnership between Christian kingdoms, came to understand that European Christianity, at least as practiced by the Portuguese, was a tool of conquest disguised as salvation. Yet, Afonso persisted, maintaining his faith even as his kingdom bled, trying desperately to preserve what he could of Congo's sovereignty and dignity. By the time Afonso I died in 1542 or 1543, after ruling for nearly 4 decades, the Kongo Empire remained powerful but was showing cracks in its foundation. The slave trade had become entrenched, Portuguese influence had grown from partnership to domination, and the delicate balance that Afonso had tried to maintain was slipping. His successors would inherit not just a throne but a crisis, a kingdom caught between its glorious past and an uncertain future, between African tradition and European Christianity, between sovereignty and subjugation. The stage was set for confrontation, for a reckoning that would test whether the Congo could resist the colonial tide that was sweeping across Africa. The decades following Afonso X's death saw the Congo Empire navigate an increasingly treacherous political landscape. A succession of Manicongos struggled to maintain royal authority against Portuguese encroachment, internal dissent, and the corrosive effects of the slave trade. The kingdom's eastern provinces grew restless, their governors chafing under central control, tempted by the wealth that could be gained by selling captives directly to Portuguese traders. The capital at Mbanza, Congo, while still magnificent, became a stage for Byzantine political intrigue as rival factions competed for influence, each claiming to represent the true legacy of Afonso I while pursuing their own agendas. The Portuguese, meanwhile, consolidated their control over the coastal regions, establishing Luanda as their administrative center in 1576, a colonial foothold that would grow like a cancer into the heart of Central Africa. But the Congo remained resilient, despite Portuguese pressure, despite internal divisions, despite the hemorrhaging of its population through slavery. The kingdom maintained its independence and its identity. Subsequent Manicongos proved capable rulers who understood that survival required both military strength and diplomatic cunning. They played European powers against each other, cultivating relationships with Dutch and English traders who appeared on the coast, offering them the same commercial opportunities as the Portuguese, but without the same colonial ambitions. They modernized their military further, incorporating more firearms and cannon, training soldiers in European tactics while maintaining African organizational structures that emphasized mobility and local knowledge. The Congo army remained a formidable force, capable of fielding thousands of warriors armed with muskets, spears, bows, and shields, a military machine that commanded respect and inspired fear across Central Africa. The Portuguese, however, were not content with trading posts and coastal enclaves. Portugal's colonial ambitions in Africa were expanding, driven by competition with other European powers and the insatiable demand for enslaved labor in the Americas. The Portuguese viewed the Congo's continued independence as an obstacle to total control over the region's human and natural resources. Tensions escalated throughout the 16th century as Portuguese governors in Luanda adopted increasingly aggressive policies, supporting rebellious Congo provinces, interfering in succession disputes, and demanding concessions that would effectively reduce the Manicongo to a Portuguese vassal. The Portuguese believed their technological superiority and military experience would overwhelm any African opposition. They would soon discover how catastrophically wrong that assumption was. The crisis reached its breaking point during the reign of Manicongo Alvaro I, who ascended to the throne in 1568. Alvaro was cut from a different cloth than his recent predecessors. He was a warrior king, a ruler who had distinguished himself in military campaigns against the Jaga invasions that had threatened the kingdom from the east. The Jaga were fearsome warriors, possibly originating from the interior regions east of the Congo, who launched devastating raids that reached the very gates of Mbanza, Congo. Alvaro had rallied the kingdom's defenses, organized counterattacks, and eventually drove the invaders back, but the experience had taught him crucial lessons about warfare, leadership, and the necessity of maintaining military strength. When Portuguese arrogance finally pushed the relationship to the breaking point, Alvaro was ready to respond with force. The Portuguese governor in Luanda, viewing Congo's internal struggles against the Jaga as evidence of weakness, made a fatal miscalculation. He began openly supporting rival claimants to the Congo throne, providing them with weapons and mercenaries, attempting to install a puppet ruler who would serve Portuguese interests. He demanded that the Manicongo grant Portugal control over the kingdom's copper and iron mines, allow unrestricted slave trading throughout Congo territory, and accept Portuguese military garrisons in major cities. These demands represented nothing less than colonization, the complete subjugation of an independent African kingdom. Alvaro I understood that accepting these terms would mean the end of Congo sovereignty. He refused, and in refusing, he set in motion events that would lead to one of the most significant military confrontations between Africans and Europeans in the 16th century. The Portuguese prepared for war with confidence bordering on arrogance. They assembled a military force that included professional soldiers armed with muskets and cannon, supported by African auxiliaries recruited from rival groups, and enslaved people forced into military service. The Portuguese commanders had experience fighting in Europe, Asia, and the Americas. They had defeated larger armies through superior tactics and firepower. They believed that a few hundred Portuguese soldiers could overcome any African force, regardless of numbers. This colonial mindset, this assumption of inherent superiority, would prove disastrous. The Portuguese were about to learn that the Congo Empire was not a collection of scattered villages to be conquered with ease, but a sophisticated military power led by a king who understood both African and European warfare. Alvaro I mobilized the full might of the Congo Empire. He summoned provincial governors and their warriors, calling on the ancient bonds of loyalty that tied the kingdom together. From across the realm, armies converged on Banza Congo, warriors carrying muskets and spears, archers with powerful bows, soldiers bearing shields decorated with the symbols of their provinces. Manikongo's call to arms was answered with enthusiasm, for this was not merely a political dispute, but a fight for the kingdom's very existence. The warriors who assembled understood that they were defending their homes, their families, their way of life against foreign invaders who sought to reduce them to slaves. This was a war of survival, and every man who could bear arms was needed. The Congo military that Alvaro commanded was more sophisticated than the Portuguese imagined. The army was organized into units based on provincial origins, each led by experienced commanders who maintained discipline and coordination. Congo soldiers had been using firearms for decades, obtaining them through trade and manufacturing some domestically. They understood musket tactics, the importance of volleys, the need for supporting forces to protect gunmen during reload times. But unlike European armies that relied almost exclusively on firearms, the Congo forces integrated guns with traditional weapons in a combined arms approach that maximized their effectiveness. Spearmen protected musketeers, archers provided covering fire, and fast-moving skirmishers harassed enemy formations. It was a military system adapted to African conditions, flexible and deadly. The confrontation between the Congo Empire and Portuguese colonial forces came to a head in a series of military engagements that would demonstrate African military capabilities and expose the limits of European power. The Portuguese, operating from their base in Luanda, launched incursions into Congo territory, confident that their superior weapons and tactics would quickly overwhelm African resistance. They marched in tight formations, muskets at the ready, cannon pulled by oxen, expecting to face the same kind of disorganized opposition they had encountered elsewhere in their colonial ventures. Instead, they found themselves facing an army that understood their tactics, matched their firepower, and fought with a determination born of defending their homeland. The first major engagement demonstrated the strategic acumen of Alvaro I and his commanders. Rather than meeting the Portuguese in open battle where European cannon and massed musket fire would be most effective, the Congo forces utilized the terrain to their advantage. The landscape of the Congo, with its rivers, forests, hills and valleys, offered countless opportunities for ambush and guerrilla warfare. Congo warriors, intimately familiar with every path and waterway, lured Portuguese columns into disadvantageous positions where their formations broke down, where their cannon became liabilities rather than assets, where their numerical advantage meant nothing. Portuguese soldiers found themselves fighting in close quarters where African warriors excelled, where spears and hand weapons negated the advantage of firearms. The battle tactics employed by the Congo forces revealed a sophisticated understanding of warfare. Commanders used scouts and runners to maintain communication across the battlefield, coordinating attacks from multiple directions to keep Portuguese forces off balance. They employed feints and false retreats, drawing enemy units into traps where they could be surrounded and overwhelmed. Congo musketeers, positioned on high ground or behind natural cover, delivered devastating volleys into Portuguese formations before withdrawing to new positions, avoiding the counterattacks that European commanders expected. The Congo army fought with discipline and tactical flexibility, adapting to circumstances, exploiting weaknesses, and maintaining pressure on an enemy that found itself confused and demoralized. Portuguese casualties mounted as engagement after engagement went against them. Soldiers who had marched confidently into Congo territory found themselves retreating, harried by warriors who seemed to materialize from the landscape itself, strike with lethal efficiency, and disappear before reinforcements could arrive. The wounded told stories of African soldiers who fought with terrifying courage, who did not break and flee at the sound of musket fire, but advanced steadily, absorbing casualties and closing to deadly effect. The cannon that the Portuguese had brought, meant to break enemy formations and inspire terror, proved cumbersome and vulnerable, requiring constant protection from infantry who were themselves under constant attack. The Portuguese colonial dream was founded in the blood-soaked earth of Central Africa. The decisive engagement came when a major Portuguese expeditionary force, determined to crush Congo resistance once and for all, pushed deep into the kingdom's territory with the objective of capturing Mbanza Congo itself. This represented the ultimate gamble for both sides. For the Portuguese, success would mean the collapse of organized Congo resistance and the installation of a puppet regime. For Alvaro I, defeat would mean the end of his reign and likely the destruction of the Congo Empire's independence. The Manicongo assembled his forces for a climactic confrontation, committing his best units and most experienced commanders to a battle that would determine the kingdom's fate. The two armies met in a clash that echoed across the African continent, a confrontation between colonial ambition and African sovereignty. The battle was brutal and prolonged. Portuguese formations, arranged in the European style with musketeers in front and pikemen behind, delivered volley after volley into the advancing Congo forces. African warriors fell, but others stepped forward to take their places, closing the distance despite the storm of lead that tore through their ranks. Congo musketeers returned fire, targeting Portuguese officers and artillery crews, causing confusion in the enemy ranks. As the lines collided, the battle devolved into savage hand-to-hand combat, where European military discipline counted for little against warriors fighting for their homeland. Spears thrust, swords clashed, and men died in the mud and grass of Central Africa, locked in a struggle that neither side could afford to lose. The turning point came when Congo forces executed a flanking maneuver that the Portuguese had not anticipated. While the main body of the Congo army engaged the Portuguese center, holding their attention and absorbing their fire, mobile units swept around the enemy flanks, moving through terrain that the Europeans had dismissed as impassable. These flanking forces, composed of some of the kingdom's best warriors, crashed into the Portuguese from the sides and rear, creating chaos and panic. Portuguese soldiers, trained to fight in organized formations, found themselves surrounded, their lines collapsing under attacks from multiple directions. Commanders shouted orders that could not be heard over the din of battle. Units fragmented as soldiers fought for their own survival rather than for colonial conquest. The Portuguese army broke. Soldiers abandoned their positions, fleeing back toward Luanda in a disorganized rout that turned into a massacre as Congo warriors pursued relentlessly. Cannon were abandoned, supplies left behind, wounded soldiers left to their fate as the survivors focused solely on escape. The retreat became legendary in its disaster, a humiliating defeat for a European power that had believed itself invincible against African opposition. Portuguese commanders, those who survived, would write reports attempting to explain the debacle, blaming terrain, logistics, treachery, anything but the obvious truth that they had been outgunned and outfought by an African army defending its kingdom. The victory secured the Congo Empire's independence and sent shockwaves through colonial circles. The Portuguese, accustomed to easy conquests in other parts of Africa, had encountered an African kingdom that possessed both the will and the capability to resist European military power. The defeat forced Portugal to reassess its approach to the Congo, abandoning plans for direct military conquest in favor of the slower, more insidious strategy of economic penetration and political manipulation. The battle demonstrated to other African kingdoms that European technological advantages could be overcome through superior tactics, knowledge of terrain, and the determination to defend one's homeland at any cost. The aftermath of the military confrontation between the Kongo Empire and Portugal reshaped the political dynamics of Central Africa for generations. Kongo Alvaro I emerged from the conflict with his authority strengthened, his military reputation enhanced, and his kingdom's independence secured. The Portuguese, chastened by their defeat, adopted a more cautious approach, maintaining their trading posts and colonial settlements, but abandoning immediate plans for military conquest of the Congo. The kingdom had won breathing space, a temporary reprieve from the colonial pressure that was inexorably building across the African continent. But the reprieve was just that, temporary, for the forces of European colonialism were too powerful, too persistent, to be permanently deterred by a single military defeat. The victory had profound implications beyond the immediate political and military spheres. Across Africa, news of the Congo's successful resistance spread through trade networks, carried by merchants and travelers who brought tales of African warriors defeating European soldiers. The story inspired other kingdoms and peoples who faced European encroachment, demonstrating that colonial powers were not invincible, that African military organization and courage could overcome technological disadvantages. The psychological impact was immeasurable, providing hope and a template for resistance that would be remembered and emulated in later struggles against colonialism. The Congo had proven that an African kingdom, properly organized and led, could stand against European military might. Within the Congo Empire itself, the victory brought a period of relative stability and renewed confidence. Alvaro I used his enhanced prestige to strengthen central authority, bringing recalcitrant provincial governors back into line and reasserting the Congo's control over the kingdom's resources. He invested in further military modernization, ensuring that the Congo maintained its technological edge and tactical sophistication. Churches continued to be built, Christian practices continued to be integrated with traditional Congo spirituality, and the unique hybrid culture that had developed over decades of Portuguese contact continued to evolve. The kingdom remained Christian in its official religion, African in its identity, and independent in its politics, a testament to the possibility of selective adaptation without complete cultural surrender. The economic consequences of the conflict were complex and contradictory. The slave trade, which had been one of the primary sources of tension between the Congo and Portugal, did not end with the military confrontation. If anything, it intensified as Portuguese traders, unable to conquer the kingdom directly, worked harder to exploit its human resources through commercial means. The flow of enslaved people from Central Africa to the Americas reached staggering proportions in the late 16th and 17th centuries, depopulating vast regions and generating enormous wealth for European merchants and American plantation owners. The Congo continued to participate in this trade, with some nobles and merchants growing rich from the commerce of human beings, even as it undermined the kingdom's long-term stability and moral authority. Alvaro I and his successors attempted to regulate the slave trade, to limit its most destructive aspects, to ensure that only war captives and criminals were sold, but these efforts met with limited success. The economic incentives were too powerful, the corruption too pervasive, the Portuguese demand too insistent. Portuguese traders continued to work with corrupt Congo officials, bypassing royal authority, expanding their operations into the interior. The slave trade became a wound that would not heal, a constant drain on the kingdom's population, and a source of social instability that no amount of military victory could resolve. The Congo had defeated Portugal on the battlefield, but could not defeat the economic system that the Portuguese had established. The religious dimension of Congo-Portuguese relations continued to evolve in fascinating ways. Despite the military conflict, the Congo remained committed to Christianity, maintaining churches, supporting missionaries, and incorporating Catholic practices into the fabric of Congo society. But it was an African Christianity, adapted to Congo culture and needs, not a simple copy of European religion. Congo Christians venerated African saints alongside European ones, integrated traditional rituals into Christian ceremonies, and interpreted scripture through African philosophical frameworks. Manikongo remained the spiritual as well as political leader of the kingdom, his authority derived from both Christian doctrine and traditional Congo beliefs in sacred kingship. This religious syncretism created a unique cultural identity that was neither purely African nor purely European, but something new and distinctly Congo. Portuguese missionary activity in the kingdom took on new characteristics after the military conflict. Missionaries, recognizing that they no longer operated from a position of colonial dominance, adapted their approach to suit Congo realities. Some genuinely attempted to serve the spiritual needs of the Congo people, learning local languages, respecting local customs, and advocating for their African congregations against the more exploitative Portuguese traders. These missionaries became valued members of Congo society, their presence tolerated and even welcomed by Manikongos, who saw them as useful sources of education and diplomatic connection to Europe. Other missionaries remained instruments of Portuguese colonial policy, gathering intelligence, fomenting dissent, and working to undermine Congo independence through subtler means than military force. The artistic and cultural flowering of the Congo during this period reflected the kingdom's unique position at the crossroads of African and European civilizations. Congo artists created works that blended traditional African aesthetics with European influences, producing sculptures, textiles, and metalwork that were distinctly Congo in character. The famous Congo crucifixes, which combined Christian symbolism with African artistic traditions, became sought-after items in European art markets, symbols of the cultural synthesis that had occurred in Central Africa. Music, dance, and oral traditions continued to thrive, incorporating new elements while maintaining continuity with ancient practices. The Congo was creating a culture that proved adaptation did not require surrender, that one could engage with foreign influences while maintaining core identity. The architectural landscape of Mbanza Congo reflected this cultural synthesis. Stone churches stood alongside traditional buildings, their construction techniques European, but their decoration African. The royal palace combined elements of Portuguese architecture with Congo design principles, creating a unique structure that symbolized the kingdom's dual identity. The city remained a center of learning and culture, attracting scholars, artists, and craftsmen from across Central Africa and beyond. Despite the conflicts with Portugal, despite the drain of the slave trade, despite internal tensions, Mbanza Congo remained a magnificent capital, a jewel of African civilization that commanded respect from all who saw it. As the 17th century progressed, the Congo Empire found itself navigating an increasingly complex international landscape. The Portuguese monopoly on European contact with the kingdom eroded as Dutch, English, and French traders appeared on the Central African coast, each seeking commercial advantages and political influence. The Manikongo played these European powers against each other with considerable skill, granting trading concessions to Dutch merchants to pressure the Portuguese, courting English traders to maintain leverage, and ensuring that no single European nation could dominate the kingdom's foreign relations. This diplomatic maneuvering required constant vigilance and sophisticated understanding of European politics, skills that successive Manikongos developed and refined. The Dutch, in particular, became important players in Central African politics during the mid-17th century. As they expanded their own colonial empire, challenging Portuguese dominance in Africa, Asia, and the Americas, The Dutch saw the Congo as a potential ally against their Iberian rivals. Dutch traders offered the Congo better terms than the Portuguese, paying higher prices for goods and selling European products more cheaply. More significantly, the Dutch demonstrated willingness to provide military support to the Congo against Portuguese aggression. This Dutch-Congo alignment represented a significant shift in the regional power balance, one that the Portuguese viewed with alarm and hostility. The competition between European powers created opportunities for African agencies that the Congo exploited skillfully. The military collaboration between the Congo and the Dutch reached its peak during the 1640s, when Portuguese-Congo tensions again escalated into open conflict. The Portuguese, frustrated by their inability to fully control the kingdom and emboldened by reinforcements from Brazil, launched new military campaigns aimed at forcing the Manicongo into submission. This time, however, Congo did not stand alone. Dutch forces, equipped with cannon and professional soldiers, joined Congo armies in confronting Portuguese aggression. The combined Congo-Dutch forces achieved significant victories, capturing Portuguese positions and pushing colonial forces back toward Luanda. For a moment, it seemed possible that European colonialism in Central Africa might be rolled back entirely, that the Congo might emerge as the dominant power in the region. But European politics are fickle, and alliances built on commercial interest can dissolve as quickly as they form. The Dutch, facing their own challenges in other parts of their global empire, eventually reduced their commitment to Central Africa. Portuguese diplomacy in Europe, combined with shifting strategic priorities, led to accommodations between the Dutch and Portuguese that left the Congo once again facing Portuguese pressure without reliable European allies. The brief window of opportunity closed, and the kingdom found itself in an increasingly precarious position. The pattern would repeat throughout the 17th century. European powers would court the Congo when it suited their interests, then abandon the kingdom when other priorities took precedence. The Manicongo learned the hard lesson that European friendship was transactional and temporary. Internal dynamics within the Congo Empire grew increasingly complex during this period. The royal succession, which had traditionally been managed through a combination of hereditary claims and political maneuvering among noble houses, became more contentious as different factions aligned themselves with competing European powers. Portuguese-backed candidates vied with Dutch-supported claimants, while still others represented purely Congo interests untainted by European sponsorship. These succession disputes occasionally erupted into civil wars that weakened the kingdom and provided opportunities for Portuguese intervention. The unity that had allowed the Congo to resist European conquest began to fracture under the strain of external pressure and internal competition for power. The slave trade continued to corrode the social fabric of the kingdom despite royal attempts at regulation. By the mid-17th century, the volume of enslaved people exported from Central Africa had reached catastrophic levels. Entire regions were depopulated, villages abandoned, and agricultural systems collapsed as populations fled slave raiders or were marched in chains to coastal markets. The demographic hemorrhage weakened the kingdom's military capacity, reduced agricultural production, and generated social instability that undermined royal authority. Provincial governors, enriched by slave trading, grew increasingly independent of central control. Some effectively operating as autonomous warlords who maintained their positions through wealth accumulated from human trafficking. A particularly troubling development was the emergence of the Pombeiros, African slave traders who operated as intermediaries between interior populations and coastal markets. These Pombeiros, often working for Portuguese or Brazilian merchants, penetrated deep into Central Africa, establishing their own trading networks, forming private armies, and creating mini-empires based on the capture and sale of enslaved people. The Pombeiros represented a corruption of African agency, individuals who used their knowledge and connections not to build but to destroy, enriching themselves through the commodification of their own people. Their activities extended the reach of the slave trade far beyond the areas under direct European control, turning Africans into instruments of their own exploitation. Yet even amid these challenges, the Congo Empire demonstrated remarkable resilience. Despite civil wars, despite the slave trade, despite European pressure, the kingdom maintained its independence and its cultural identity. The institution of the Manikongo endured, continuing to command loyalty and respect from the majority of Congo people. The capital at Mbanza, Congo, though perhaps not as magnificent as in earlier decades, remained a significant urban center and symbol of Congo civilization. The Christian faith that had been adopted over a century earlier had become thoroughly integrated into Congo identity, providing spiritual resources that helped the people endure suffering and maintain hope. The kingdom bent under the weight of external and internal pressures, but did not break. One of the most remarkable figures to emerge during this period was Manikongo Antonio I, who ruled from 1661 until his death in 1665. Antonio came to power during one of the kingdom's darkest hours, with civil war having weakened royal authority and Portuguese aggression reaching new heights. He inherited a kingdom in crisis, its provinces divided, its military depleted, its population traumatized. But Antonio proved to be a leader of exceptional capability and courage. He moved quickly to restore order, reconciling competing factions, reasserting central authority, and rebuilding the military forces that had been diminished by years of internal conflict. He understood that the Congo's survival depended on unity, and he worked tirelessly to forge that unity in the face of existential threats. Antonio, I also recognized that the Portuguese posed the greatest danger to Congo independence. The colonial government in Luanda, under Governor Tristão da Cunha, had adopted an increasingly aggressive policy toward the kingdom, making demands that would effectively reduce the Manikongo to a Portuguese vassal and allow unrestricted slave trading throughout Congo territory. These demands were accompanied by military threats and support for Antonio's rivals, an attempt to coerce the king through intimidation. Antonio, I refused to submit, understanding that acceptance of Portuguese terms would mean the end of Congo as an independent kingdom. Instead, he prepared for war, mobilizing the kingdom's resources for what he knew would be a climactic confrontation with colonial power. The tensions between Manikongo Antonio I and Portuguese governor Tristão da Cunha escalated throughout 1665, with both sides preparing for a confrontation that would determine the future of the Congo Empire. The Portuguese assembled a formidable military force in Luanda, including professional soldiers from Portugal and Brazil, African auxiliaries from groups hostile to the Congo, and enslaved people pressed into military service. They brought cannon, muskets, and supplies for a sustained campaign. The Portuguese objective was clear: crush the Congo militarily, depose Antonio I, and install a puppet ruler who would grant Portugal everything it demanded. This would be a war of conquest, an attempt to finally achieve through military force what diplomacy and political manipulation had failed to accomplish. Antonio, I understood the magnitude of the threat. He issued a call to arms that resonated throughout the kingdom, summoning warriors from every province, calling on the ancient obligations that bound the Congo people together. The response was overwhelming. Thousands of warriors assembled, bringing with them the accumulated military experience of generations of resistance against foreign aggression. These were not untrained villagers, but disciplined soldiers, many of whom had fought in previous conflicts, who understood firearms and battlefield tactics, who were prepared to die defending their kingdom. Antonio organized this force into a coherent army, appointing experienced commanders, distributing weapons, and preparing for the kind of large-scale battle that would decide everything. In October 1665, the two armies met at Mbwila, also known as Ambwila, a location in the northern part of the Congo Kingdom. The Battle of Mbwila would become one of the most significant military engagements in Central African history, a clash between African sovereignty and European colonialism that would echo through the centuries. Antonio, I personally led his forces, understanding that his presence on the battlefield would inspire his warriors and demonstrate his commitment to the kingdom's independence. The Manikongo rode at the head of his army, surrounded by his elite guard, carrying the symbols of Congo kingship, prepared to give everything for his people's freedom. The battle began with artillery exchanges as Portuguese cannon fired into the Congo formations, while African gunners returned fire with their own artillery pieces. The roar of cannon and musket fire echoed across the battlefield, smoke obscuring the vision of soldiers on both sides, creating confusion and terror. Congo warriors advanced under this fire, moving with the discipline that years of training had instilled, closing the distance to where their superior numbers and hand-to-hand fighting skills would give them advantage. Portuguese formations held their ground, delivering volley after volley into the approaching African soldiers, cutting down warriors by the dozens, creating piles of dead and wounded that others had to climb over to continue the advance. As the Congo forces closed with the Portuguese lines, the battle devolved into savage melee combat. Spears thrust, swords slashed, and men grappled hand to hand in a desperate struggle for survival and victory. Antonio, I fought in the thick of the battle, his presence inspiring the warriors around him, his courage undeniable. The tide of battle swayed back and forth, with neither side able to gain decisive advantage. Portuguese soldiers found themselves pushed back by the sheer ferocity of the Congo assault, while African warriors fell to Portuguese firepower and disciplined formation fighting. The ground became slick with blood, the air thick with the screams of the wounded and dying, the very earth trembling under the fury of the combat. Then disaster struck the Congo forces. In the chaos of battle, Antonio I was killed, struck down either by musket fire or in hand-to-hand combat. Accounts differ. The death of the Manikongo sent shockwaves through the Congo army. Warriors who had been fighting with inspired courage faltered as word of their king's death spread. The carefully maintained formations began to dissolve as soldiers looked around desperately for leadership, for orders, for some way to make sense of the catastrophe that had befallen them. Portuguese commanders, recognizing the opportunity, pressed their advantage, launching coordinated attacks against the now disorganized Congo forces. What had been a hard-fought battle turned into a rout as the Congo army broke and fled, leaving their dead king on the battlefield. The Battle of Mbwila was a catastrophic defeat for the Congo Empire. In addition to Antonio I, many of the kingdom's most important nobles and military commanders were killed, creating a leadership vacuum that would have devastating consequences. The Portuguese, however, were too exhausted and too depleted themselves to immediately exploit their victory. They had won the battle, but at tremendous cost, with casualties that left them unable to march on Mbanza Congo and impose direct colonial rule. The battle had demonstrated once again that conquering the Congo militarily was far more difficult than European arrogance suggested. Even in defeat, the Congo had inflicted such damage on the Portuguese that outright conquest remained impossible. The aftermath of Mbwila plunged the Congo Empire into a period of civil war and chaos that would last for decades. With Antonio I dead and so many senior nobles killed in the battle, competing factions emerged to claim the throne, each backed by different provincial power bases, and, in some cases, by different European patrons. The kingdom fragmented as these factions fought each other, turning their military strength inward rather than against external threats. The Portuguese, unable to conquer the Congo directly but delighted by its internal collapse, worked to keep the kingdom divided, supporting different claimants to ensure that no strong, unified leadership could emerge to threaten Portuguese interests. The capital at Mbanza Congo, that magnificent city that had stood for centuries as the symbol of the kingdom's greatness, was eventually abandoned. The succession wars made it impossible for any Manikongo to maintain secure control of the traditional capital, and the city fell into ruin, its stone churches crumbling, its palaces emptying, its streets growing silent. The loss of the capital was more than symbolic. It represented the breakdown of the centralized authority that had held the kingdom together. Without a functioning capital, without a universally recognized Congo, the Congo Empire existed more in memory than in reality, a ghost of its former glory. Yet even in this dark period, the Congo identity persisted. The people did not forget who they were, did not abandon their culture or their history. In villages and provinces across the former empire, people continued to identify as Congo, to tell stories of their kingdom's greatness, to remember the Congos who had ruled with wisdom and courage. The Christian faith that had been adopted generations earlier provided spiritual continuity, offering hope and meaning amid the chaos. Churches, even if they fell into disrepair, remained sacred spaces. Priests and religious leaders, even if they lacked formal institutional support, continued to minister to their communities. The Congo people endured, adapting to new circumstances, surviving the disasters that had befallen them. The decades following the Battle of Mbwila saw various attempts to restore the Congo kingdom to its former unity and strength. Several claimants to the title of Congo emerged, each controlling different portions of the former empire's territory, each claiming to be the legitimate heir to the tradition established by Lukeni Luanimi centuries earlier. Some of these rival Congos were capable leaders who genuinely attempted to reunify the kingdom, to restore central authority, and to rebuild what had been destroyed. Others were little more than warlords, using the prestige of the title to legitimize their control over limited territories. The competition between these rival claimants prevented any single leader from achieving the widespread recognition necessary to truly restore the kingdom. One of the most fascinating developments during this period was the emergence of Kimpa Vita, also known as Dona Beatriz. In the early 18th century, Kimpa Vita was a young Congo woman who claimed to be possessed by Saint Anthony, who declared that she had been sent by God to restore the Congo kingdom and reunify its people. She preached a syncretic Christianity that emphasized African identity, declaring that Jesus Christ and the saints were actually black Africans, that the Holy Land was in Congo, and that European Christianity had corrupted the true faith. Her message resonated powerfully with a population traumatized by decades of civil war and foreign exploitation. Thousands flocked to her, inspired by her vision of restoration and renewal. Kimpa Vita's movement represented a remarkable assertion of African religious and cultural independence. She challenged both the traditional Congo nobility, who had failed to reunify the kingdom, and the Portuguese missionaries, who had allied with colonial interests. She called for the rebuilding of Mbanza Congo, arguing that only by restoring the sacred capital could the kingdom be truly reunified. Her followers began returning to the abandoned city, rebuilding structures, establishing communities, creating the nucleus of what they hoped would be a restored kingdom. For a brief moment, it seemed possible that this prophet might succeed where political and military leaders had failed, that spiritual revival might accomplish what warfare could not. But the established powers viewed Kimpa Vita as a threat. The rival Congos saw her movement as a challenge to their authority. The Catholic Church considered her teachings heretical, a dangerous corruption of Christian doctrine. Portuguese colonial officials feared that a unified, religiously inspired Congo would be more difficult to manipulate and exploit. In 1706, Kimpa Vita was captured by forces loyal to one of the rival Congos. She was tried for heresy and witchcraft, convicted by a tribunal of Portuguese missionaries and Congo nobles, and burned at the stake. Her execution was meant to destroy the movement she had inspired, to demonstrate the futility of resistance, to reimpose the authority of both church and state over a population that had dared to imagine alternatives. The martyrdom of Kimpa Vita did not immediately end her influence. Her followers continued to venerate her memory, to preserve elements of her teachings, to maintain hope for the kingdom's restoration. But without her charismatic leadership, the movement gradually dissipated, its energy absorbed back into the fractured political landscape of the former empire. The rebuilding of Mbanza Congo stalled, and the city once again fell into disuse. The dream of restoration faded, replaced by the grim reality of continued division and Portuguese domination. Kimpa Vita's brief emergence had demonstrated the Congo people's continued longing for unity and independence, but it had also shown how difficult achieving those goals had become. Throughout the 18th century, the Portuguese steadily expanded their control over the regions that had once comprised the Kongo Empire. The slave trade reached its peak during this period, with hundreds of thousands of Central Africans forcibly transported to the Americas, particularly to Brazil, where Portuguese colonial interests demanded an endless supply of enslaved labor. The demographic catastrophe hollowed out Central African societies, depopulating vast regions and destroying social structures that had existed for centuries. The various Congo successor states, weakened by internal divisions and depopulation, lacked the strength to resist Portuguese encroachment. What had once been achieved through military conquest was now accomplished through economic dependency and political manipulation. The 19th century brought new challenges and slight glimmers of hope. The gradual abolition of the Atlantic slave trade by European powers removed one of the primary drivers of conflict and exploitation, though illegal slavery continued and was replaced by other forms of forced labor. European imperialism entered a new phase, with direct colonial administration replacing the earlier system of coastal trading posts and indirect control. The Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885 formalized the European partition of Africa, with Portugal claiming vast territories in Central and Southern Africa. The lands that had once formed the Congo Empire were divided between Portuguese Angola, the Belgian Congo, and French Equatorial Africa, arbitrary colonial boundaries that ignored historical, cultural, and political realities. Yet the memory of the Congo Empire persisted. Throughout the colonial period, the descendants of the kingdom's people maintained their identity, telling stories of their ancestors' greatness, remembering the Mani-Congos who had ruled with wisdom and strength, preserving cultural practices that connected them to their past. The Congo language survived, evolving but maintaining continuity with its historical forms. Artistic traditions continued, adapted to colonial circumstances, but retaining distinctive Congo characteristics. The Christian faith, which had been adopted centuries earlier, remained central to Congo identity, though interpreted through African frameworks that the original Portuguese missionaries would not have recognized. The people endured, their culture bent but unbroken by centuries of exploitation and oppression. The 20th century brought African independence movements that drew inspiration from pre-colonial African kingdoms. The Congo Empire, with its history of sophisticated governance, military resistance to European power, and cultural achievements, became a powerful symbol for those seeking to throw off colonial rule and establish independent African nations. The kingdom demonstrated that African political organization, African military capabilities, and African culture had flourished long before European colonialism. That independence was not a foreign concept imposed from outside, but a return to African historical norms. Leaders of independence movements invoked the memory of Mani-Congos, like Afonso I and Antonio I, presenting them as models of African leadership and resistance. When African nations finally achieved independence in the mid-20th century, the territorial divisions established by European colonialism largely remained. But the cultural legacy of the Congo Empire transcended these artificial borders. In Angola, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and the Republic of Congo, populations identified strongly with Congo heritage, seeing themselves as heirs to the kingdom's traditions. Political movements drew on Congo symbols and history to build national identity and legitimacy. The kingdom that had officially ended centuries earlier continued to shape the politics, culture, and identity of millions of people across Central Africa. Today, more than 5 centuries after Portuguese ships first appeared at the mouth of the Congo River, The legacy of the Congo Empire continues to resonate across Africa and throughout the African diaspora. The kingdom's story has been recovered from Portuguese archives, from oral traditions preserved across generations, from archaeological investigations of sites like Mbanza, Congo, which was designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 2017 inches, recognition of its historical significance. Scholars have reconstructed the sophisticated political systems, the military achievements, and the cultural accomplishments of a civilization that European colonialism nearly erased from history. The Congo emerges from this scholarship not as a footnote to European expansion, but as a major African power that shaped regional history and resisted colonial conquest for centuries. The military confrontations between the Congo Empire and Portuguese colonial forces, particularly the battles during Álvaro I's reign and the Battle of Mbwila, occupy important places in the history of African resistance to European imperialism. These engagements demonstrated that African kingdoms possessed military capabilities sufficient to defeat European forces, that technological advantages could be overcome through superior tactics and determination, that colonial conquest was not inevitable, but could be resisted and sometimes prevented. The victories that the Congo achieved inspired other African peoples facing European aggression, providing both tactical lessons and psychological encouragement. The defeats that the kingdom suffered illustrated the terrible costs of resistance and the challenges of maintaining independence in the face of relentless colonial pressure. The cultural legacy of the Congo Empire extends far beyond the borders of modern Central African nations. The millions of enslaved Central Africans who were forcibly transported to the Americas carried with them elements of Congo culture, language, and religion that would influence the development of African diaspora communities from Brazil to the Caribbean to North America. Congo words entered Creole languages and African American vernacular. Congo religious concepts influenced the development of syncretic faiths like Vodou, Candomblé, and Santeria. Congo artistic traditions shaped African diaspora aesthetics. The kingdom's cultural influence, paradoxically spread through the trauma of slavery, can be traced across the Atlantic world wherever African diaspora communities exist. The religious history of the Congo Empire offers particularly fascinating insights into cultural adaptation and resistance. The kingdom's adoption of Christianity in the 15th and 16th centuries was not a simple case of African submission to European culture, but a complex process of selective adoption, creative reinterpretation, and cultural synthesis. The Congo created an African Christianity that was simultaneously genuinely Christian and genuinely African, demonstrating that cultural exchange does not necessarily mean cultural destruction. The figure of Kimpa Vita, who preached an explicitly African Christianity, represents perhaps the fullest expression of this synthesis, a vision of the faith that centered African experience and rejected European cultural dominance. Her story has inspired subsequent generations of African theologians and religious leaders who seek to develop authentic African expressions of Christianity. The political legacy of the Congo Empire includes important lessons about statecraft, diplomacy, and the challenges of maintaining sovereignty in an unequal international system. The Manikongos, who ruled during the period of Portuguese contact, faced impossible choices, attempting to gain the benefits of European trade and technology while preventing colonial domination. Leaders like Afonso I demonstrated remarkable sophistication in their diplomatic maneuvering, playing European powers against each other, selectively adopting foreign innovations while maintaining core institutions and identity. That these efforts ultimately failed to prevent colonial encroachment should not obscure the skill and determination with which they were pursued. The kingdom's experience offers insights relevant to contemporary debates about globalization, cultural exchange, and maintaining identity in the face of powerful external forces. The archaeological and architectural heritage of the Congo Empire provides tangible connections to this history. The ruins of Mbanza, Congo, the old capital, stand as testimony to the kingdom's architectural achievements and urban sophistication. Stone churches, some still partially intact, demonstrate the synthesis of African and European architectural traditions. Archaeological excavations have revealed the extent and complexity of the city, with evidence of dense settlement, craft production, and international trade. The preservation and study of these sites contribute to African historical consciousness, providing physical evidence that counters colonial narratives that denied or minimized African civilization. Efforts to preserve and restore Congo heritage sites represent important assertions of African history and identity. The linguistic legacy of the Congo Empire survives in the Kikongo language and its related dialects, spoken by millions of people across Central Africa. Kikongo belongs to the Bantu language family and preserves vocabulary, grammatical structures, and oral literary traditions that connect contemporary speakers to their historical past. The language carries within it the accumulated wisdom, cultural values, and historical memory of the Congo people. Efforts to document, preserve, and promote Kikongo represent important work in maintaining cultural continuity and resisting the linguistic imperialism that threatens indigenous African languages. The survival of the language ensures that the kingdom's legacy remains accessible to its descendants in their own tongue. The artistic traditions associated with the Congo Empire continue to influence contemporary African and African diaspora art. The distinctive Congo aesthetic, characterized by particular sculptural forms, decorative patterns, and symbolic systems, can be traced through centuries of artistic production. Congo power figures, with their distinctive nail-studded appearance, have become iconic representations of African spiritual art. Congo textiles, particularly raffia cloth with its intricate patterns, influence textile traditions across Central Africa. Contemporary artists draw on this heritage, creating works that honor traditional forms while addressing modern concerns, demonstrating the continuing vitality and relevance of Congo artistic traditions. The story of the Congo Empire's resistance to Portuguese colonialism has been recovered and celebrated by African historians, writers, and filmmakers as part of the broader project of decolonizing African history. For too long, the narrative of African history was written primarily by European colonizers who portrayed their conquests as inevitable results of European superiority. The recovery of stories, like the Congo's military victories over Portuguese forces, challenges these colonial narratives, presenting a more accurate and empowering account of African agency, capability, and resistance. This work of historical recovery is not merely academic, but contributes to contemporary African identity, pride, and self-understanding. The Kingdom of Congo stands in African history as a testament to what African civilizations achieved before colonialism, to the sophistication of African political and military organization, and to the possibilities of cultural synthesis and adaptation. The empire demonstrated that African kingdoms could engage with European powers as equals, that they could selectively adopt foreign technologies and ideas while maintaining their own identity, that they could resist military conquest through strategic brilliance and determined courage. The kingdom's eventual fragmentation and the Portuguese colonial domination that followed should not be read as evidence of African weakness, but as testimony to the overwhelming force and persistence of European imperialism, a system that eventually overwhelmed even the most capable African resistance. The Congo River still flows through Central Africa, its waters carrying the memory of kingdoms that rose and fell along its banks. The forests still stand, though diminished by centuries of exploitation. The descendants of the Congo Empire still live in the lands their ancestors ruled, still speak languages descended from Kikongo, still practice faiths that blend African tradition with imported religions, and still create art that echoes ancient forms. The kingdom itself, as a political entity, vanished centuries ago, its last legitimate Manikongo dying without a universally recognized successor, its capital abandoned and reclaimed by vegetation. its provinces absorbed into colonial empires. But the spirit of the Congo endures, carried in the hearts and minds of millions who remember, who honor, who refuse to let this history be forgotten. The Congo Empire defeated the Portuguese not once but multiple times, proving that European military technology and colonial ambition could be overcome by African strategy, courage, and determination. These victories secured the kingdom's independence for generations, allowing Congo culture to flourish and adapt on its own terms. When defeat finally came at Muila, it was not for lack of fighting spirit or military capability, but because the accumulated pressures of centuries of conflict, exploitation, and internal division had finally overwhelmed even the most resilient resistance. The kingdom fell not in a day but gradually, over decades of civil war and Portuguese manipulation, a slow tragedy rather than a sudden catastrophe. Yet even in this tragedy lies inspiration. Congo fought. The kingdom resisted for 200 years, maintaining its independence longer than almost any other African kingdom, facing European colonial pressure. Its leaders demonstrated diplomatic sophistication, military innovation, and cultural creativity in their struggle to preserve African sovereignty. Its people endured suffering with courage, maintained their identity through catastrophe, and ensured that their history would not be completely erased. The Kingdom of Congo, in its rise, its resistance, and even its fall, stands as one of the great stories of African civilization, a testament to human resilience and the enduring power of cultural identity. The river flows on. The story continues. The legacy of the Congo Empire lives wherever people remember that Africans built great kingdoms, defeated European armies, and fought with everything they had to preserve their freedom. This is not a story of defeat but of courage, not a tale of victimization but of agency, not a narrative of weakness but of strength. The Kingdom of Congo defeated the Portuguese, and in doing so, secured a place in history that no amount of colonial erasure could destroy. The memory endures, powerful and unbroken, like the river that gave the kingdom its name.